The Nature of Order is a 4-volume work published between 2002 and 2005, representing the culmination of Alexander's lifelong inquiry into what makes buildings, cities, and human artifacts feel alive, and what makes them feel dead. It is, in scope and ambition, one of the most significant works of architectural philosophy ever written. Alexander himself considered it his masterwork, the destination toward which a pattern language, 1977, was only a first step. Carlos E. Perez has finally made the connection of his Quaternion process theory of cognition to Alexander's The Nature of Order. Alexander achieved something extraordinary. But there are specific problems he could only name rather than explain, things he could gesture at, but not account for. QPT provides the formal machinery that makes those gestures into explanations. 1. Why quality cannot be named. Alexander spent 4 volumes circling the quality without a name, insisting it is real, demonstrating it empirically, arguing that its resistance to naming is not a defect of language, but something fundamental. But he could not explain why it resists naming. He could only assert that it does. QPT explains it with precision. Omega is firstness. Naming is thirdness. Firstness is precisely independent of thirdness. It can be attended to while neglecting thirdness, but thirdness cannot be produced without firstness already being present. The quality precedes the name not contingently, but structurally. Every name captures an aspect of omega, but not omega itself, because the name is a thirdness operation on something precisely prior to thirdness. This is not just a restatement of Alexander's claim. It is an explanation of the mechanism, and it makes a further prediction. No amount of additional properties, no richer taxonomy of centers, no more careful linguistic work will ever fully capture omega, not because human language is impoverished, but because the precisive ordering makes full capture impossible in principle. 2. Why quality sensing cannot be outsourced, scored, or aggregated. Alexander insisted that quality sensing is personal and non-delegible. He demonstrated this through his mirror of the self test, asking which of 2 configurations makes you feel more whole, more alive. He knew that metrics and rubrics miss something, but he had no formal account of why. Alexander knew this. QPT explains why it is necessarily so, and why every attempt to replace quality sensing with evaluation will fail, regardless of how sophisticated the evaluation criteria become. Scoring is always nu to nu. Quality sensing is always omega to kappa to nu. These are categorically different processes, and the categorical difference is not eliminable by improving the scores. 3. Why the generative sequence cannot be shortcutted. Alexander insisted on the non-transitive ordering of his generative sequence. Large-scale patterns before small-scale ones. You cannot build a beautiful room before the street outside it is alive. He argued this from experience and intuition, but he had no formal account of why the ordering cannot be bypassed. QPT formalizes this as the non-transitivity of the developmental graph. Later tensions presuppose earlier tensions, because the foundational homeostats that create conditions for later ones cannot be passed over. Development is not a logical entailment relation, which can be chained transitively, but a developmental dependency. Each step genuinely creates conditions that did not exist before. This is a structural claim, not an empirical generalization. It explains why no amount of clever design can compensate for missing foundational structure, why putting a beautiful threshold on a dead street still produces a dead threshold. The conditions were not there. The developmental graph is non-transitive by architecture, not by convention. 4. The 3 distinct failure modes of a living process. Alexander could identify when a structure or process was dead. He could often say that something had gone wrong, but he lacked a systematic account of how many ways a generative process can fail and what distinguishes them. QPT provides the 3-layer pathology diagnostic, which is arguably its most practically powerful contribution. The 3rd failure is the most subtle and the most important. A management team with the right governance structure, genuinely engaged, reading dashboards instead of observing operations. The loop is structurally intact. The people are genuinely attending, but the material flowing through the loop is new, convention, reports, where kappa, direct causal encounter, is required. The process is alive in form and dead in substance. Alexander had no vocabulary for this. He could tell when the result was dead, but he could not diagnose which layer had failed. QPT makes the 3 layers independently diagnosable, with different interventions for each. 5. The difference between pattern discovery and pattern cataloging. Alexander always insisted on discovering patterns through quality sensing, feeling the quality of a place, tracing it to the forces in play, naming what held those forces in tension. He knew that merely applying criteria to classify structures was different from discovering a pattern, but he could not formally characterize the difference. QPT makes the distinction precise and locates it in content phase. Pattern discovery. Quality felt at 1. CE, before forces are encountered, before the pattern is named. R-driven. The discovery descends from felt quality through causal encounter to formal naming. Produces living patterns that resonates. Pattern cataloging. Criteria applied before structures classified before patterns named. No quality sensing, only evaluation against pre-existing conventions. Produces formally adequate descriptions that may or may not resonate. This matters enormously for what happens after Alexander. Most of the pattern language industry that followed him, in software architecture, design, organizational theory, was doing cataloging, not discovery. The catalog grew. The aliveness diminished. QPT explains exactly why. The living quality departed when quality sensing was no longer the starting point. Alexander could observe this degradation. QPT explains its mechanism. 6. The quality gate, alive and grounded. Alexander required that each transformation intensify the life of the whole. He tested this through quality sensing. Does this feel more alive? But he had no systematic way to couple this test with a separate grounding check. Is it actually true? Is it factually adequate? Is it correctly sensing what is actually there? QPT formalizes this as the R natural join G quality gate and derives 2 distinct failure modes. R sensing deadness, G confirming failure. The structure is structurally or attentionally broken. Fix the loop. R sensing deadness, G disconfirming failure. Outputs correct. The structure is content phase degraded, formally sound, correctly operating but hollow. The work is being done without encounter. This is the most diagnostically subtle case, and QPT is the only framework that makes it legible. Alexander could not distinguish these 2 cases. He could sense deadness and adjust, but he had no way to formally identify the case where everything appears to be working. Outputs are correct, and yet the process is dead at the content phase layer. 7. What a nonchasm is, and why it produces dead structure. Alexander could tell the difference between a living and a dead building process. He attributed the deadness of modern construction to planning, mass production, centralized control, and the severing of feedback between maker and material. But his account of why these produce deadness was phenomenological, rich, accurate, but not formal. QPT provides the formal account through the distinction between agapism and ananchasm. Agapic, the developmental step, is guided by omega, by felt quality sensing where life is weakest and what transformation would intensify it. The structure grows from the inside out. Anancastic, the developmental step, is forced by mechanical pressure, by deadline, specification, planning document, external mandate. The structure is imposed from the outside in. Critically, condition 5 of the operator, the agapic orientation condition, is the only condition that cannot be checked through formal analysis. Conditions 1 to 4, activation, opposition, cell friction, excess variety, are all formally checkable. Condition 5 requires attending to omega. This is why planning produces dead structure. Planning satisfies conditions 1 to 4. The structure changes, but cannot satisfy. Condition 5. The change is not guided by quality sensing. The result is mechanically adequate structure, M***, that functions but does not live. Alexander knew this. QPT explains exactly which condition planning fails to satisfy and why it cannot be made to satisfy it by becoming more sophisticated. 8. Collective quality sensing and its conditions. Alexander's framework is fundamentally individual, one practitioner, or a small team, responding directly to a site. He had nothing systematic to say about how quality sensing operates across large collectives, or what the conditions are for genuine collective aliveness. QPT adds R.collective, shared quality sensing, as a named compositional pattern and distinguishes it formally from aggregated individual quality sensing. Collective quality sensing requires shared encounter with completed products, kappa.current, not reports about products, NU prior. The quality of the whole exceeded the sum of individually perceived qualities is genuine, not merely claimed. The feedback cycle acceleration principle formalizes when collective quality sensing develops faster, when the omega right pointing arrow kappa feedback cycle is short. Alexander would recognize this immediately. But he had no vocabulary for why large organizations consistently fail to maintain living quality sensing, even when talented individuals within them could sense quality perfectly well. QPT answers it. The collective graph requires individual developmental foundations, non-transitive, and collective quality sensing requires kappa.current, shared encounter with actual outcomes, which large organizations systematically replace with nu.prior, reports, dashboards, metrics. The content phase diagnosis applies at collective scale, just as it does at individual scale. 9. The precisive ordering of the developmental curriculum. Alexander knew that practitioners need to develop quality sensing before they can use formal pattern vocabulary effectively. But he had no theory of why this ordering is correct, or what happens when it is reversed. QPT makes this precise through the precisive ordering and the encounter curriculum. This follows directly from precisive ordering. Quality, firstness, before encounter. Secondness, before formal understanding. Thirdness. You cannot develop genuine quality sensing by starting with the specification and working backward. The practitioner who begins with new, reading the theory, and never develops omega sensing, can catalog, but not discover they run M* rather than R. The specification notes the consequence precisely. New arrives after kappa and omega, not before them. Alexander lived this as practice. QPT explains why it is necessarily the right order, and what goes wrong when the order is reversed. 10. Self-application and recursive growth. Alexander could not apply his framework to itself. A pattern language contains no pattern for how to extend the pattern language. The nature of order does not describe how to write further volumes using the same generative process. The framework describes the generation of living structure in the world, but offers no account of how the framework itself should grow. QPT applies its own standards to its own development, and the Alexandrian warrants for vocabulary extension. The theory develops itself through the same compositional process it describes. New vocabulary must pass the quality gate, R natural join G. It must feel alive, 1 CE test, and be grounded. And it must satisfy 4 conditions before being admitted. Application-driven, discovered through use, not invented speculatively. Genuinely inexpressible, cannot be said with existing vocabulary. General, applies beyond the origin domain. Quality, makes the language more alive. This is Alexander's generative sequence applied to the theory itself. The framework eats its own cooking. QPT's developmental praxis commitment is itself an example. It was discovered through application, was inexpressible in previous version, generalizes to all QPT domains, and made the language more alive. It therefore satisfied its own warrants for admission. Alexander had no such self-referential architecture. QPT's recursive self-modification commitment establishes that the framework can grow through the same agapic process it describes. Summary. What QPT expresses better is not what Alexander discovered, but why it is the way it is. Alexander had the phenomenology. QPT has the mechanism. The advances fall into a clear pattern. Alexander could say it. QPT explains why it must be so. Alexander gave us the phenomenology of living systems. Quaternion process theory of cognition gives us the formalization of his deeper intuitive insights. This has potential to further the field of pattern language development, and hence processes of creative building across many domains.